Well, hello and welcome to this virtual conversation with Phil Dow on his new book, Accidental Diplomats, American Missionaries and the Cold War in Africa. My name is Judd Birdsall. I serve as a senior fellow with the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. And I want to thank my Berkley Center colleagues for arranging today's event. Well, I'm excited about this book, or primarily for two reasons. First, substantively, for how it adds to our understanding of American missionary history and to the impact that American missionaries had in the consequential years of the Cold War. And second, personally, because Phil and I were both supervised by Andrew Preston at Clare College, Cambridge, and I'm delighted to see Phil's doctoral research published for a broad audience. I remember when the audience was just our small PhD seminar during my first year and Phil's final year at Cambridge. One week I was assigned to critique one of Phil's chapters, something I was totally unqualified to do as a first-year student. I don't remember anything about my critique, but I do remember being very impressed by the quality of Phil's research, the quality of his writing. And so it's great to see his book now published by William Carey Press. Phil is currently the head of school at Black Forest Academy in Germany, and previously he was the superintendent of Roslin Academy in Nairobi, Kenya. And I've had the pleasure in recent years of visiting Phil and his family in Kenya and in Germany. Phil and I are also both third culture kids, having been raised overseas, and our kids are third culture kids. So Phil, thanks so much for joining me in conversation today. The format for today's conversation is pretty straightforward. Phil will give some remarks about the book, and then we'll use the remainder of our hour together for Q&A with the audience. Thank you, audience, for joining us. If you have a question, you can type it at any time by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please do be as brief as you can be in phrasing your question. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be published on the Berkley Center website and on YouTube as soon as possible. And for those who registered for today's event, you'll get an email with the link to that video as soon as it's ready. Well, Phil, thank you so much for joining us in conversation today. Congratulations on this book. Tell us about these accidental diplomats in Cold War Africa.
Well, Judd, thank you, first of all, for inviting me to do this and a chance to introduce my book to a wider audience. And thank you for you, the participants. I'm looking forward to the questions at the end. I'm going to speak for about 20, maybe 30 minutes at most, introducing the book, the characters of the book, the basic arguments. But I'm only going to be scratching the surface, of course. So I'm looking forward to hearing your questions, whatever they may be, whatever might have prompted your curiosity for more. What I thought I'd do is just start off with an explanation of how I came across this topic, why I chose this topic for my PhD, and a little bit about that story. And then I'm just going to give the background, the context of the story, why the story matters, and to give you a bit more of a flavor of the people and the context before we get into the argument itself. And then I'll flesh out the argument as well as I can in a relatively brief period of time, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. That's all right. So whenever you're choosing, as my guess is many of you have done, choosing a dissertation or topic or a PhD thesis topic, you want to do something that is going to fill a hole in the literature, a gap in the literature. Find something that people either haven't written about, or that there's something that there's a compelling debate that you want to enter into. In my case, it was a gap in the literature. There wasn't really a debate about the impact of missionaries on diplomacy or foreign relations, because it wasn't really a topic of conversation in academia in any substantial sense, at least as relates to evangelical missionaries. So that was that. Check that box. But you also want to write about and research something that is compelling personally to you as well. What really, as I was beginning to think about doing a PhD, this is about 2005, so we're almost 20 years ago now that this process started. I read a book by Walter Russell Mead called Special Providence. And in that book, which is a compelling, obviously a very compelling book in its own right, he has kind of a throwaway comment, especially referencing, I think it was late 19th century, early 20th century American foreign policy. And he said that this hidden story of, and I'm paraphrasing here, the hidden story of American foreign relations is the story of American missionaries. But no one's really written about that in any substantial sense. There's a guy named Fairbanks in the 1970s who wrote on it, but outside of that, there wasn't a lot that had been done. As soon as I read that comment, I said, "This is what I want to do. This is a compelling, fascinating topic, and it's relevant to me and the world that I grew up in." So my parents lived overseas for most of my upbringing. And my dad was a project director for a foundation, a Christian foundation that worked with indigenous Christian groups in Africa primarily, but also the bridge between North American Christians, especially evangelical Protestants, and the churches the churches in Africa. So I was surrounded by missionaries and African converts to Christianity growing up. That was the world that I grew up in. And so initially when I read Walter Russell Mead's comment, that's the secret story of, or the story of American foreign relations is linked to the story of Protestant missionaries. And I, by the way, I should say it as an aside, I focus on evangelical Protestants primarily, but there's an entirely and a significant story of Catholic missionaries, American Catholic missionaries, that is being told and is an important part of this larger story as well. But anyway, so I was surrounded by evangelical Protestants, both American and African growing up. And when I first came across that, I said, yes, this strikes me as important. But when I looked around me, I didn't necessarily see examples of American missionaries being influential in diplomatic affairs in the world that I saw. I saw them involved in on the margins in rural Africa or with students, but certainly not hobnobbing with diplomats and political elites. So I was initially both interested and a little skeptical regarding Mead's comment. But then I thought about an experience I had in high school, and that was 1988. I was a senior in high school at a school called Rift Valley Academy, which is a school that was originally founded for the children of evangelical Protestants, largely American, but not entirely. One day in my senior year, school was canceled because we were going to have a special visitor to the school for the day. We didn't know much about what it was or who's coming until maybe a week or two before. And it turns out it was the president of Kenya, Daniel Arap Moi, who is going to be coming to visit the school. And he spent an entire day at the school. We all got to meet him. We shook his hand. He met with different people around the school. And it strike, oh, great, the president of Kenya, this is significant. But we didn't really reflect on it as high school students until later. I read this comment by Walter Russell Mead, and I thought, oh, actually, why would the president of a country come to this rural expat missionary school? Why would he take an entire day out of his very busy schedule to do that? And the answer was obvious to all of us, and that was because we knew, having gone to that school, the school is started by a group called African Inland Mission, which is a international non-denominational mission, largely American, but British as well. And that mission started its work around the turn of the century, 19th, 20th century, and they were involved in an area called Eldoret. Now, Eldoret is where Daniel Arap Moi grew up, and it turns out that he wasn't just in that orbit, but he was actually converted by AIM missionaries. He was essentially raised by a family of AIM missionaries, lived with them, was educated by them, mentored, discipled in his faith, which was growing strong as a child. And then it was actually encouraged to enter into politics, which is a very non-AIM type of thing to do, and I'll get to that later. But so he, and to that day, 1988, he continued to be surrounded by some of the kids that he had grown up with that became friends and mentors to him, even as a Kenyan politician. So suddenly I have right in front of me a blatant example of American missionaries having an influence on certainly African politics, but also a link between American diplomats and Kenyan foreign policy policymakers. So I realized, okay, there is a story, at least in Kenya, and at least related to the second Kenyan president, Daniel Arap Moi. But is this a one-off? Is there a pattern of this, or have I just happened to come across one particularly compelling example of that influence? And so that's what I wanted to discover. So I began doing my research. So I'll stop there with the introduction and move to the context, because the Cold War context makes this story, gives sense to this story. As all of you will know, the Cold War begins essentially at the end of World War II, and division between the communist East and the capitalist or democratic West, generally speaking. And by the mid-1950s, certainly by the end of the 1950s, that Cold War had developed into a stalemate, certainly symbolized by the split of Germany, where I live now, and ultimately symbolized by the split of Berlin. Berlin, the capital, being divided into East and West Berlin. So when that stalemate happened in Europe, in a sense, that the energy of the stalemate, and this is written by plenty of others in far more compelling ways than I'm explaining it now, but it spilled over into the rest of the globe. So you have what Wested called the global Cold War. And we see that in Southeast Asia, but increasingly scholars are seeing, well, this spilled over into Africa. And Africa actually became one of the focal points for the global Cold War, especially because during the late 1950s and early 1960s, Africa experienced the most remarkable political transformation that happened in the 20th century, and that was going from a colonially governed states to independent African countries. Between 1959 and 1963, no less than 27 countries became independent in Africa. So this story, that as the stalemate of the Cold War happens in Europe, bleeds over into the rest of the world, Africa becomes this contested ground where newly independent countries are determining their own course for their future. Are they going to go with the capitalist democratic West or the communist East, or are they going to go a third way? And that was really up to anyone's guess at that point. But both the Soviet Union and communist powers and the West, in particular America, started suddenly paying a great amount of attention to Africa, because that was where, in a sense, the moral argument could happen. These countries now are choosing for themselves, and whatever direction they choose will help tilt the Cold War, at least in terms of a moral argument, towards one side or the other. So both sides start putting a lot of time, energy, money in some cases, into Africa, where they hadn't really paid attention to Africa in a significant way prior to that point. In large part because for the United States, they stayed out of it because the colonial Western powers were that was their area, and the United States was expected to stay out of it. So that's the context. We have this contested ground in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and the expectation, I should say, too, among American policymakers and global policymakers, was that the Soviet Union and communism probably had a natural advantage in that global Cold War in Africa, because communism was explicitly anti-colonial. Its rhetoric, its practice was anti-colonial. America, of course, could claim a history of colonialism because it itself was a colony and had broken free from that. But really, it was closely connected to all the Western colonial powers. So that was compromised greatly. And certainly as that relationship grew closer, America was seen as part and parcel potentially of colonialism. And America had its own history, of course, in the Philippines and elsewhere, where any claim of anti-colonialism was at least somewhat compromised. So the expectation would be that the Soviet Union and the communist powers would have an upper hand in this battle for Africa, or for influence in Africa. But what ends up happening is much more ambiguous. And if anything, I think one can argue that the United States ultimately won, or at least had the upper hand in the global Cold War in Africa, certainly in the countries that I look at, and that's Ethiopia, Kenya, and Democratic Republic of Congo, or Zaire. So the question is why? How, if America had a natural disadvantage in Africa, did they end up having a significant influence in Africa and have much of Africa follow a somewhat ambiguously pro-Western course? And my answer is that even American evangelical missionaries were the secret ingredient to America's, wherever they had success, evangelical missionaries were a significant part of that. So that's the context. That's the basic thesis. The title of the book, Accidental Diplomats, speaks directly to the thesis as well, and that is these evangelical American missionaries go out to these countries with no interest in political influence. I shouldn't say no interest, but marginal influence and political interest. They are there for religious reasons. If you read all of their letters home, if you read their biographies, if you read all the mission literature, politics is never on the, I shouldn't, again, you never say never. Rarely does politics show up. They're talking about going out because of their faith. They want to share their faith. That's the reason why they're there. And as a result, they want to love their neighbor. And so in Africa, you see them going out, they're planting churches, they're starting schools, they're translating the Bible, they're starting hospitals and clinics and so on. And that's the work that they're doing. And they're oftentimes doing this in rural, marginal areas, far from the centers of power, even in colonial and post-colonial Africa. So if their interest is political influence, they're going to the wrong places and they're doing the wrong things. But what happens is when the U.S. starts paying attention to Africa, I realize, oh my goodness, we have this thousands of Americans who have been there for 20, 30, 40 years doing this work, building these relationships, building a goodwill towards at least these American missionaries, and largely building goodwill, although as I'll mention too, the story is not one of angelic American evangelicals. They're flawed people with flawed agendas, and there are mistakes that happen for absolutely. But the American policymakers see, wow, we have all these Americans who have relationships with the Kenyan or Zairean people or the Ethiopian people, and sometimes elites within those countries. And suddenly they become a significant player accidentally. They go out for religious reasons, and they end up having a significant influence in the story of the Cold War in Africa. So I was going to talk a bit about who were these evangelical missionaries. So why don't I take a minute to do that, and then I'll talk about why I chose the countries that I did, and what made them, I think, particularly interesting to me. So first thing about the American evangelical missionaries is that they were very different from the 19th century or early 20th century American missionaries that we may have come across in the literature. They were not, typically speaking, from establishment churches or mainline churches. They were not typically from privilege, or many of the missionaries that went out were students who they had gone to Harvard or Yale or Princeton. They were members of mainline congregations that had a lot of political influence in America at the time. The evangelical missionaries that went out after World War II were a very different breed. They tended to come from places, like Houghton, New York, or Toccoa Falls, Georgia, or from small independent churches. They didn't come with a lot of connections to political or economic or social power in the United States. They went out being sent out by these small congregations or groups of small congregations. So they weren't politically, economically, educationally sophisticated or elite. They were very much, you could say, I mentioned in the preface of the book, I call them the pioneers of transnational populism. And really, they represent a new set of global travelers who didn't have the ability, financial or communications and transportation wise to get out around the world. That wasn't an option until after World War II, where suddenly the United States had wealth that they hadn't that was unique in global history. Transportation technology had opened up to the extent that you could get around the world quickly, and communication technology had changed too. So these three things suddenly created a moment where average people could go all around the world in a way that they couldn't before. And who had the motivation to go around the world? Well, it was these evangelical Protestants who felt a biblical call to go around the world to share the Christian message. And that was at the core of their theology. So that's who they were. They were not necessarily sophisticated, cosmopolitan, well-connected people. They were relatively marginal characters, probably on average, less educated than the average American, and certainly not close to the center of politics or economic influence. The work that they did, I've already referenced, but I want to briefly mention that before I talk about the countries too. They went out, as I said, for religious reasons. So they were planting churches, they were evangelizing, they were translating the Bible, which for evangelical Protestants was at the core of their faith. The Bible is God's word to humanity, according to the evangelical Protestants, and so we want that message to be in the language of the people that they are seeking to share this message with. So they would learn the languages. They would be in the countries for 10, 15, 20 years, learning the culture and the language so that they could translate the message into not just, and sometimes actually they're taking an unwritten language and making it a written language. And in the process, also understanding the culture and translating that message into written form. So on multiple layers, they're getting to know a culture at a depth that would be very unusual for the typical expatriate. So they're translating the Bible. They're starting schools because they wanted the Kenyans or Ethiopians or Congolese, wherever they're going, to be able to read and to write, because that's also a part of their theology in terms of wanting to read the Bible for themselves. And they saw significant suffering, and so they also, as part of their mandate to love their neighbor as themselves, they started clinics and hospitals. Most of the schools, most of the hospitals that were developed in certainly Ethiopia and Kenya were a result of missionaries, not just American Protestants. There were a significant number of Anglican missionaries too, British Anglican missionaries. And when you get to DRC, the number of Catholic missionaries and the hospitals and schools developed by the Catholic missionaries were numerous as well. So that is one other important thing I should mention about the evangelical missionaries is that they were not counter to stereotype. They were not an arm of colonialism. In fact, the British colonial government and the colonial government in the Belgian Congo were very skeptical and resistant. They were a pain in the neck to these because they weren't part of they weren't Belgian missionaries, they weren't British missionaries. They weren't part of the colonial effort. They were annoying do-gooders that sometimes contradicted or conflicted with what the agenda of the colonial governments would be. Sometimes they went along with it as well. So it was, but they were untrustworthy allies, I guess you could say, for the colonial governments. So in many cases, they were seen as American kind of mavericks that were untrustworthy. All right, the three countries I chose, Ethiopia, Kenya, and DRC or Congo. I chose because I wanted to see if the story that I thought I saw in Kenya through Daniel Arap Moi, for instance, was a one-off or whether it had universal applicability. So these three stories are very different. Ethiopia was one of potentially, I guess, two African countries that were not significantly influenced by colonialism. Ethiopia was colonized, I guess you could say, by Italy for a few years in the beginning of World War II. So about 7 years of significant colonial, really wartime influence by Ethiopia, and that actually is still visible in Ethiopia today. But really, they have a history for a 2,000 history of independence and an indigenous Christian tradition in Ethiopia for 2,000 years as well. So they're unique in Africa. And so hold them for a second. Kenya was your classic British colony. A lot of religious freedom, which allowed for American missionaries to get engaged. But they were a class. There was a significant number of expats that came to settle and to be a part of the colonial project. If you've read about the memo, you know that Kenya did. There was a violent revolt against the colonial project, and Kenya got its independence in 1963. But they represent the quintessential British colony. And then you have a DRC or Congo or the Belgian Congo, which was essentially a private, a unique in Africa in that it is a personal colony of King Leopold that transitioned to being a Belgian colony that was deeply influenced by Catholicism because the Catholic Church in its relationship with the Belgian government had significant influence in Belgium. So three very different stories. So my question was, what was universal? What was common across these three countries? What was unique? And basically what I found was, I should say too, that these three countries are unique too, in that there is a particularly high number of American evangelical missionaries in these three countries. So I chose them because there's a lot going on. So, and what I found is, in each of the three countries, American evangelical missionaries had an influence in probably all of the following four ways. First of all, they had an influence on African political leaders. I mentioned that with Daniel Arap Moi as a prime example, but that happened in each of the three countries. They had an influence on the grassroots. In fact, there's a great quote by the chief of staff, I believe it was Carter, saying that there was a popular consensus, a pro-West popular consensus in Kenya when they were seeking to expand relationships with Kenya during the 1970s. And they pointed to the influence of American evangelical missionaries as the cause of that. So there's an influence on the African grassroots through religious transformation, conversions, education, healthcare, and the like. Kenya in 1900 had about 5% Christian, actually less than 5%, about 1%. It was 0.02% as I'm going back and thinking through the numbers in the book. In 1900, by 2000, post-Cold War, Kenya is about 80+% Christian. Now that includes about half Protestant and half Catholic within that number. So there's an extreme religious transformation that happened in Africa during the 20th century, and missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant, were a significant part of that story. Although indigenous missions becomes probably the bread and butter of that story too. And then there is American evangelical missionary influence on American public opinion. Not many Americans paid close attention to Africa during the 1940s and 50s. Europe and their domestic affairs were obviously front and center, and perhaps Korea and Vietnam, so Southeast Asia and East Asia, probably taking the remainder of their attention. So Africa is off the radar for most. The people who did know about Africa were people in these evangelical Protestant churches across the country who would hear missionaries come back and talk about their work. So if you read denominational literature or mission literature or letters from these missionaries to churches that would be read in the churches or when they came back and spoke about their work, that's how a large percentage, 30, 40 million people, I shouldn't have used that number. That there wouldn't have been 30 or 40 million people that would have all heard these things. But within the group of evangelical Protestants in America, a decent percentage would have heard whatever they knew about Africa would have been from missionaries, and that was generally positive. There was a sense of these missionaries were going, and there was a brotherhood that someone like Melanie McAllister would talk about of a what's the phrase that she uses? Anyhow, there is an emotional religious bond between the African church and the evangelical Protestant church that missionaries were the bridge for. And so that's also a significant part of the story. And then, of course, there was influence on American political elites that didn't happen naturally, but it happened when the Cold War erupted in Africa, and they realized we have these people on the ground that are significant advantage for us, and we want to, and they did oftentimes harness that a political advantage on the ground. All right, so that's the broad scope. I've gone, I think, 30 minutes already. So let me just finish with one example. And there's many examples like this in the book, but I'll use one. A guy named, I shouldn't say a couple, named Don and Lida McClure. Go to Ethiopia in 1928, I believe. Young, just recently graduated missionary couple. They go to Ethiopia and they serve in rural Ethiopia among a group called the Anuak people that are animists. In other words, they have traditional African beliefs. They go and they work with them amongst them for about 15 years. During that 15 years, they build clinics, build multiple schools, start multiple schools, and are very effective in evangelism. For whatever reason, the story of the animist story that was part of the root of the Anuak culture resonated very well with the Christian message. And so by the time that they finished their work 15 years later and handed it over to Anuak leaders, about 25,000 of the 40,000 Anuaks had converted to Christianity, which is a remarkable story in terms of influence. It's not unique, but it's unusual. And they had all these schools and clinics that were serving thousands of people a day. So in the midst of this, Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia, hears about what's happening on the margins of his Ethiopian empire, and he goes to visit Don and Lida McClure in rural Ethiopia. As a result of that visit, Don and Haile Selassie become close friends. And so for the next 30 years, Haile Selassie and Don McClure, whenever Don McClure is in Addis Ababa, he goes to the palace and sits down with Haile Selassie and talks about the work that they're doing. Because Haile Selassie himself is a Christian, and he sees that this mission work he believes will have an advantage in terms of helping Ethiopia become a Christian nation, that he envisions it to be a modern Christian nation. So they become friends, and as American policymakers start to pay attention to Ethiopia as a potentially non-colonial piece of the African puzzle, they see these missionaries who have access to Haile Selassie that they don't have. And so they go to Don McClure and say, hey, how can you help us share what we want to share with the emperor so that we can have this relationship with Ethiopia? And Haile Selassie sees missionaries as an advantage for his desire to have a closer relationship with Ethiopia. So Don McClure, and he's not alone, becomes a bridge where the Ethiopian monarch and American policymakers are connecting, and that happens over the next 30 or so years. By the time Don McClure, he's killed by Somali rebels in, I think, is 1977. So after Haile Selassie had already been deposed, which I think was 1974. But by the time he dies, McClure has friendships with American presidents, congressmen, diplomats, ambassadors, as well as the Ethiopian royal family. And he didn't go out there for this reason. He went out to be a missionary. And yet he becomes a centerpiece in the relationship between these two countries. All right, that's where I'll stop. I went a bit longer, but hopefully there's enough in there to spur a few questions.
Well, thank you so much, Phil, for that overview of the book and where the research came from. Really fascinating. A reminder to our audience that you can type your questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a few good questions already that I'll want to get to. As you're thinking of questions, Phil, let me just toss out one for you. Curious to know more about your methodology in this book. You mentioned the letters that missionaries sent back. So archival research. You also conducted interviews talking with some of the people who were part of this story. I'm curious as to how that went, and if anything, there's any anecdotes of things that struck you. Were these missionaries happy to share the sort of diplomatic intrigue they were a part of? Was there pride in it? Was there ambivalence about it? Anything you'd want to share from the research that you did for this book?
Yeah. Methodology. I spent a lot of time in the National Archives here in the States, in the DC area, College Park, the State Department Archives. That was a significant piece of the project. I also spent a significant amount of time in mission archives across the United States. Wheaton College has a Billy Graham Center where a lot of mission organizations have their letters and records. So I spent a lot of time there. Other places, the Methodist and Presbyterian archives. So there's a lot of archival work. A lot of those were higher level correspondence or memos or whatever it may be. That was significant. Missionary biographies as well as diplomatic biographies were another significant source. Autobiographies were another significant primary source. But then I also spent a lot of time going to retirement homes where missionaries were and interviewing them and hearing their stories and asking them if I could see their correspondence. And many of them were very willing to do that. So between official archives, autobiographies, and other primary source documents, and then interviews, those would be the three main sources or categories. Not to mention, of course, all the secondary literature that help build the larger context. But that would be where the story came from. In terms of what I found, and your question about ambivalence and how did missionaries feel about their interaction with U.S. or diplomats or African elites, the answer is all of the above. Many of these evangelical Protestants were explicitly apolitical. Many of them come from a strong separation of church and state tradition. And so while they were very American in terms of their political outlook, they were proud Americans. They were patriotic Americans, many of them. But they also saw the danger of a church and state being too closely related and how that had been the work to the detriment of previous generations of missionaries, whether it's American or otherwise. So there was a real hesitancy to get involved or to be politically engaged. Having said that, what you see in the letters is it's like, why do we go and watch James Bond movies? There's an intrigue about spies and high level diplomacy, and missionaries were not immune to getting caught up in that. And so you see that in some of the characters I shouldn't say characters, some of the people that I'm reading about and that I interviewed. So there was both a suspicion, a caution, and a level of interest or intrigue that were there simultaneously, and it depended on the individual. You had very, very few missionaries that actually were knowingly giving information to, let's say, the CIA or becoming a part of the CIA work. Okay, that was very, very, very rare. It did happen, but that would have been a missionary kind of going rogue. The other missionaries would have been very disappointed with that choice had when and did that when and if that happened. But it did happen. A lot of the information that was exchanged between missionaries and U.S. government, whether diplomats or uh, or otherwise, would have been through exit interviews when they were forced to leave a country, or missionary pilots flying a diplomat to some rural part and stories that they're hearing. As the U.S. diplomatic presence grew in Africa, the role of or the connection between missionaries and diplomats declined because American diplomats had their own people on the ground. They didn't need to rely on missionaries as much. So near the end of the Cold War, you see much less direct contact. But before the Cold War and well, actually post World War II up through the first couple decades of the Cold War, you see a lot of engagement just because they're the only other Americans that are there. So the diplomats are like, hey, come over to our house for dinner. We want to talk football because no one else wants to talk about Alabama football, let's say. So there were friendships that developed just because they were common compatriots, overseas. I don't know if that answers your question, Judge.
No, it definitely does. Thank you, Phil. Well, we have a bunch of questions now and 18 minutes left to get to all these. So I want to make sure we get to as many of these questions as possible. Thank you, audience, for sending in these many, many good questions here. One from Neil. This is sort of an antecedent question. What preparatory impact do you think the East African revival during the 20s and 30s had on the courses chosen by newly independent countries during the Cold War? He also asks, relatedly, did the East African revival slogan, Jesus satisfies, have any effect on reactions to communist appeals about what satisfies? And maybe also related to your talk, in what ways did that sort of prepare the soil, as it were, for post-World War II American missionaries?
Yeah. So that is an extremely important part of the story that I actually don't spend enough time on in the book, is the East African revival. And the answer is it had a massive influence on trajectory of Kenya in particular, but of East Africa in the Cold War. And that was America was seen as the country that believed in God, and the roots of the East African revival, which actually had a strong British connection, but also some American influence. But it was largely an indigenous religious revival that was sparked by and supported by missionary efforts. But that I interviewed a guy named Bethuel Kiplagat, who is the foreign minister in Kenya during part of the Moi era. And he talks about how that changed. People who were impacted by that no longer saw themselves as Kikuyu or Luo or Kipsigis or whatever it may be. They saw themselves as Christians first and foremost. Their identity transcended tribe and became this new tribe of Christians, where their identity was primarily first and foremost Christian, and then and that identity as Christians created a bond with American and British missionaries that bonded them to the other countries as well. So that did have a massive grassroots influence on Kenya in particular, but East Africa as a whole. Less so in Ethiopia, that's a separate story. But yes, an excellent question and one that deserves more attention than I give it in the book.
All right, a question from Jean Guerin about the role of education. She asks, what role did education or lack thereof of the missionaries play in the development of education and health systems in these countries, good or bad?
Yeah, so I mentioned, I think at the beginning, that a lot of the evangelical Protestant missionaries that came out to Africa post World War II were not highly educated, although among evangelicals in America, they would have been more educated than the average evangelical because their missions would have required them to at least have like a Bible college degree, most of them, and many of them would have had BAs. Okay, so that they would be more educated than the average evangelical, but not highly educated compared to the 19th and 20th, early 20th century missionaries coming from Harvard and Yale and Princeton and so on. So the question then is what, I mean, one of the criticisms, and a legitimate criticism of American evangelical missionaries in Kenya, for instance, was that they started schools just like many of the other missionary groups. The Anglicans did a tremendous job of starting some really good schools in Kenya. I'm using Kenya as an example, but the same thing applies to greater or lesser degrees in Ethiopia and DRC as well. But one of the criticisms is that the American schools just did the basics. Teach them how to read and write so that they can read the Bible and grow in their faith. Okay, so it was a means to an end. Where some of the other mission groups said no, education is an end in and of itself, and so the argument was that the quality of education was higher at some of the non-American or non-evangelical schools than had been the case with the evangelical schools. So quality became an issue. In fact, there is a kind of debate among Kenyan Christians. Well, do we go with this denomination or this denomination? Well, this one has better education, so we're going to become Presbyterians. We're not going to become kind of American Baptists like the AIM. But having said that, even these schools that were not necessarily outstanding at the beginning become influential. I mentioned Daniel Arap Moi being educated by American Protestant missionaries. He goes on to become the second president of Kenya, a very controversial second president, I should say as well. But a good way to think about the influence of mission education on Kenya was that Jomo Kenyatta, who's the first president of Kenya, 3/4 of his initial cabinet had been educated in mission schools, some of which were American. I think about half of those were American schools, and the other half would have been British. So massive influence in terms of mission education on the first generation of political leaders in Kenya and also DRC and to some extent in Ethiopia. DRC, massive country, extremely complicated, but at least 3 of the key people at the beginning of independence for Democratic Republic of Congo were mission educated, including Tshombe, which was the leader of a breakaway. He's actually, he's a critically important figure. His story is deeply interwoven with his missionary education. So
your comments just now lead nicely to the first question posed by Stephen Offit. He says, Moi and Selese are both controversial figures in that they come under criticism for human rights foibles, to say the least. Do you see interaction with evangelical missionaries as impacting these leaders through espousing leadership strategies or political values in particular ways?
Yeah. So again, let me use Moi as the example because he is so morally ambiguous. He had this a number of writings that he wrote. One of which is called Nyaya, which is his kind of philosophy of governance. And if you read that book, it's essentially a Christian track on politics, explicitly Christian with goals that even non-Christians might see as noble and praiseworthy in terms of the good of humanity, the education for all, et cetera, et cetera. What Moi's story, there's tribal politics, there's his conversion to Christianity, there's real like his story. There was a coup attempt in 1982, and when that coup happened in 1982, Moi essentially started to retrench and surround himself with loyalists. Those loyalists, whether they're Christian or not, became his inner circle, and they became increasingly powerful. And with power, without accountability, came corruption and holding on to power. So I'm rambling here. I'm not answering your question well at all, but all to say, the influence of Moy. Here's a good illustration. There is a family named the Andersons who were AIM missionaries who were who were mentors for Moy throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They were killed in a car accident in the mid 80s. I don't remember the exact date, but many people point to Moy's trajectory as a political figure to that date of their death and the lack of influence that they had obviously after their death on Moy, as being him being somewhat untethered from the roots that he had developed as a young man, and his course becomes increasingly erratic and increasingly his human rights record becomes increasingly dubious. So, to what extent is that accurate? I'm not sure, but I think it's an interesting moment and touch point in that story. I would say the longer Moy is president, the less contact he has with missions. But to the day that he dies, I interviewed him in, I guess it would have been 2009 or 10, and he was a very elderly man at the time. And he continued to talk about, the first thing he wanted to talk about was his faith and how important that was to him. So these things lived in Moy's world at the same time, and the contradictions were clear to an outsider. Someone needs to write another biography of Moy because there's so many contradictions in what he said he believed and then what he did. Having said that, Moy was also, I believe, the first African leader to voluntarily give up power. They had multi-party elections, and Kenya now has had, I think, 3 or 4, actually no, 4 or 5 peaceful, relatively peaceful, with a couple of notable exceptions, transfers of power, and Moy was the first to model that. You don't see that in many other places in Kenya prior to Moy's decision.
Another question from Steve Offit that I think is a good one to toss in here. He says USAID and other U.S. government humanitarian agencies would likely also be active in the same marginal communities as evangelical missionaries were in Africa. Do you know if they might have also interacted or impacted the work of these government development agencies?
Yeah, so what I'd say on that is as independence happens, USAID is not involved in Kenya until you get well into the 70s and 80s. At least not in a significant way. Up to that point, it's American missionaries and a few initial diplomats who are influential. But as USAID, as the money starts pouring in, the influence of USAID grows significantly, and the influence of American missionaries declines significantly. So they were working with similar groups, but in very different ways. USAID had a lot of financial resources and a lot of political connection, big programs. The missionaries were working oftentimes couples or groups of families in remote areas, and they're there for long periods of time. 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And where USAID will come in with a project, maybe it has a 5-year lifespan. So it's a different model, but definitely USAID and even UN-related organizations, their influence is now significant when compared to that of missionaries. So there's my story is really looking at a unique window in time, from World War II to really the 80s, where they, because they had been there before anyone cared, I mean, that's extreme, but before the world's attention was on Africa, they were there. And so their influence was much more organic, much more, I guess you could say, deep, but not necessarily wide, where USAID's influence and impact would be significant now, in contrast to that of missionaries.
Thank you, Phil. The first question that was posed was from Paul Ramshaw, and this gets us into sort of contemporary political and moral debates. Are U.S. missionaries responsible for how conservative Protestantism in Africa is?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, the African church is its own thing now, and they're setting their own course. But having said that, I think you can see the influence of American evangelicalism on, again, I think primarily of Kenya, because that's where I lived, and that's where that's where I saw the African church lived out daily. And you do see, for better, for worse, you see things that you could come right off of, an evangelical church in the U.S. and just change the language or change the accent, and it's the same. Having said that, it's not the same. It's being interpreted differently. It's being experienced differently. It's being lived out differently. But the influence of American evangelicals on African Christians, those who've come through the evangelical or Protestant, who are converted or raised up in that context, is clear. Yeah, so the answer is, I think yes, to some extent. The politics and the cultural values of African Protestants, especially those who are evangelical Protestants, the influence of the American church has been significant and continues. There is but having said that, the African church is keenly aware of its needing to go its own course and needing to do what makes sense within the African context. And so, one other thing I should add as I kind of ramble on here is traditional African values are quite conservative. And so when you combine African traditional values and evangelical Christianity, you have a naturally, socially, culturally conservative perspective that would come out of that. And I think we see that in places like Uganda and Kenya as it relates to a lot of the current debates surrounding sexuality and gender, for instance. So yes, there is an influence, but I would also highlight African traditional culture is conservative on those same issues. And so which is the greater of the two influences? I'm not sure, but both would be important.
Well, thank you, Phil, for engaging with all these questions. We're coming to the end of our time, so let me bring things to a close. Thanks to all who posed questions to our speaker. Sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but if you're curious and learning more, then pick up the book. I assume it's available on Amazon and on the William Carey Library website. But Phil, congratulations on this new book. Thank you so much for joining me in conversation today. My thanks also to the Berkley Center for hosting today's webinar. Oh, the link to the book was just put in the chat for everyone to take a look at. Again, a link to this webinar will be sent to you via email as soon as it's ready, and we look forward to seeing you in future Berkley Center webinars. Thank you so much.